Hello and welcome to ANTH 3701R, Cultures of Mexico and Central America. I'm Dr. Hepp. I'll be your professor for this course. You can find details about how the course is organized and what the expectations are for your grade and so forth on the syllabus. In this lecture, I will just be introducing the course, giving myself a little bit of an introduction as well, giving you a little background on who I am so you understand where the class is headed. I'm an archaeologist by training. I'm in the Department of Anthropology, obviously, and this course is really meant to be mostly a cultural anthropology course. We will principally be talking about modern cultures of Mexico and Central America, but we are going to start with some background in the archaeology of Mesoamerica. So if you've already taken my Mesoamerican archaeology course, the first couple of lectures will be review for you. And then throughout the course, we will take sort of a historical perspective on different aspects of Mesoamerican culture. And then we'll also kind of move around thematically to discuss things such as literature and gender roles and protests and political movements and so forth in Mesoamerica, Mexico and Central America. So our primary goal for this course is to focus on the native peoples of Mexico and Central America, as well as, to a lesser degree, their diaspora communities in other areas where they've moved, such as the United States. We're going to place a fair amount of emphasis on the archaeological record of Mesoamerica, in part because of my own area of focus in anthropology, but we're going to be returning frequently and sort of focusing throughout the class on modern Mesoamerican people. There's also going to be a fair amount of discussion of some difficult topics, such as the conquest of Mesoamerica by the Spanish, such as aspects of history that are difficult to discuss, warfare, religion, gender roles, things that might be considered difficult topics or even taboo subjects. So that's going to be an ongoing theme in this course, but I do think that the course as a whole has kind of an overall uplifting message. So keep that in mind. If it seems that we're talking too much about civil wars and so forth and everything seems kind of dreary, I think the course as a whole has an uplifting message. The archaeology of Mesoamerica is a huge topic. Obviously, we could discuss that for an entire course. I really think we could discuss it for multiple courses. And I do have other courses focused on that. In the first few lectures of this class, I will be giving the highlights of Mesoamerican archaeology. So we'll talk about some of the major places and times, such as you can see here in the main picture in the background, the city of Teotihuacan, considered a UNESCO World Heritage Site, one of the most powerful and large urban settlements in pre-Hispanic Mexico. We'll also be talking about more small-scale, intimate lives of ancient people in their households, in the way they raised their crops, in the way they carried out their ritual practices and so forth. So we will take a chronological perspective. We'll briefly touch on the peopling of the New World. We will move up through the archaic and formative period. Then we'll discuss the classic period when the largest urban settlements in much of Mesoamerica were constructed. And then we'll discuss the post-classic period that led right up to the time of the arrival of the Spanish. The conquest of Mexico, as it's been called, and the conquest of the New World in general is this massive historical event, or really a historical process that kicked off centuries of colonialism in the New World. So we are going to be discussing this, but we're also going to have the take-home message that in some ways the project of conquest, the project of wiping out indigenous culture and replacing it with European culture, replacing indigenous religion and worldviews with European beliefs and so forth, that project was never fully completed. Modern Mesoamerican indigenous people still in many places speak their native languages. Indigenous beliefs have blended with introduced European beliefs and so forth. So the conquest of the New World First of all, it was not just perpetuated by the Spanish. It was not just Cortez and a few conquistadors who managed to do this. It was a much more complex series of events. But also, it wasn't the end of the story for indigenous Mesoamerica, and that's going to be one of our big topics for this course. Part of what the colonial period represents and what the conquest sort of kicked off was the insertion of Mesoamerica into a global context. So you have these unique Mesoamerican cultures that had developed on their own, apart from European contact. And then when the Western world is sort of thrust upon them suddenly, Mesoamerica became a global place, and it was connected to the rest of the world. And the sort of flow of information and influence was not just one direction. It wasn't just that Mesoamerica sort of accepted influence from the outside world, but rather the outside world also learned a lot and changed in some really significant ways because of indigenous Mesoamerican culture and accomplishments. And as we will discuss in this class, if you don't believe that, just going to the grocery store and looking around at the domesticated foods that we have in the produce department, for example, in the grocery store, hopefully by the end of this class it'll be really clear just how much of a debt we owe to indigenous Mesoamerica, even in the foods we eat, in the sports we play, in other social events that we practice, in music that we listen to. Indigenous Mesoamerica has had a huge influence on the rest of the world. So I want us to consider the conquest both as a horrible, violent time and a really difficult event and series of events, but also in some ways as kind of a failed project, that it never fully realized its goal of wiping out indigenous culture. One of the reasons that I believe the conquest was never fully realized, and one of the things I would like us to keep in mind in this class, is how does agency of individual people and communities interact with powerful forces politically and culturally from the outside world? One concept that is useful to consider here is resistance. Another concept that's useful to consider here is hegemony. Now, hegemony is a social concept that was developed largely by a scholar known as Antonio Gramsci. And Gramsci was famously writing some of his greatest works while imprisoned in Europe in the 20th century. And he was a Marxist. He was interested in the works of Karl Marx, and he was, intimately aware with the systems of power that political regimes use to suppress resistance and uprising and so forth. And one of the things he argued was that in his concept of hegemony was basically that powerful governments only need to use force to subdue their detractors until they're able to use ideas, basically until they're able to conquer the mind. So once the powerful government can conquer the mind, they no longer need to use violence. They simply have the ability when they need to. So how does a government or how does a culture go about conquering people who might question it? One way to do that is to make the values and rules of the elite class appear natural. That there's a natural order to domination, that the dominated classes deserve to be dominated or need to be dominated. So we could consider that in some really interesting ways in our own society. We have, in the developed world, one of, if not the largest population of imprisoned people, often for unviolent or nonviolent crimes in this country. To what extent has our political and cultural system sort of made that appear natural to us so that we no longer question it? For example, we have more people locked up in prison than we have working in our agricultural fields. In any other society in the entire history of humanity, that would be a shocking statement, and I think it's a shocking statement. But here, it's taken on, I would argue, a sense of kind of naturalness. it's been sort of, we've been convinced that it becomes natural. So one of the ways that this is accomplished is that the subordinates, or the people who are being dominated, believe that by following the rules they eventually will become the powerful. And so the state sets about separating and isolating people in order to control and supervise them. This, of course, Gramsci would be thinking this as he's locked up in his prison cell. And governments are safe from critique and question as long as they can basically force their detractors to be isolated. And as soon as groups can gather and question and assemble and form an organized political sort of body of their own, that's when they come to question the authority of the ruling class. So I do want to say here that this class isn't going to be entirely a Marxist class from beginning to end, but these concepts of resistance, of how governments might control, of how a colonial regime might control the conquered peoples in a new area, these might be useful for us to think about as we move through this class. So again, I want us to question, as we discuss pre-Hispanic Mesoamerica, the arrival of the Spanish in the 16th century, and then centuries of colonial control by the Spanish government in New Spain, for example, in parts of Mexico and Central America. How much was this really a conquest? That's one thing I want to explore in this class. And I want to say, first, this is not to deny the huge and in many cases really, really awful impacts of European incursion into the New World. This is not to downplay that at all, but rather in this class I want to sort of explore the way indigenous cultures survived and today in many ways are able to thrive despite centuries of European influence and colonial dominance in Mesoamerica. So I want us to at least consider, for the sake of argument, how native peoples of Mesoamerica remain in some important ways unconquered. Important ways might include the survival of native languages, the not just survival but explosion of native cuisine. For example, I do research in the Mexican state of Oaxaca, and food in Oaxaca is now considered by UNESCO to be an example of world heritage. It's being celebrated globally. Food in Oaxaca is one of the things that place is really famous for. So native food in parts of Mesoamerica hasn't just survived, it's become vogue. It's popular in New York City. You can get what they claim at least to be Oaxacan food. In some ways, native cosmologies, native ways of understanding the universe, of looking at the meaning of life and reality and the cosmos and so forth, those have remained. Kinship practices have persisted and so forth. Despite all of this, I'm not arguing that Mesoamerica could ever again be pre-Columbian or pre-conquest in any way. I'm not suggesting that modern indigenous peoples are somehow living fossils at all. I just want to explore the agency and the ability of native peoples to persist, to resist, and to survive some really difficult centuries of European influence. So we've talked a lot about Mesoamerica, and though the title of this class is Mexico and Central America, really I'll be using the term Mesoamerica a lot. So what does that mean? It's actually a complicated term. The term has both cultural and geographical sort of implications. In terms of looking at a map geographically, when I say Mesoamerica, I mean much of Mexico and much of Central America. It's extremely a diverse area in terms of topography, in terms of the biome, in terms of the plants and animals that live there, and culturally, linguistically, in terms of cuisine. It's an extremely diverse area. It's also a term that for researchers, for academics, has changed over time, and we'll talk a little bit about how it's changed and what it sort of is taken to mean today. But it's worth considering that terms like Mesoamerica, terms like even Mexico and Central America, are often indicating kind of an outsider perspective, a Western tendency by the sort of people in positions of influence to define identity in national terms or geographical terms or ethnic or racial terms. Ironically, and I think this is really key, and I think we should consider this as we read the textbook, as we go through the lectures of this class, for indigenous Mesoamericans, when I've spoken with them, when I've read about them, when I've researched them, and something that comes up in your textbooks, for indigenous Americans, Mesoamericans, often identity is not about what race they are. It's not about what ethnicity they are. It's much more granular. It may be what village they come from, not just even what state, like Oaxaca or something, but even what village or what language do they speak. That could be a really key aspect of identity. Others might be, kinship groups or maybe social classes within a native group. So I think it's worth considering, even as we read these kind of outsider terms applied to identity in Mexico and Central America, it's worth considering what is identity to the people we're discussing? What is it? What is the most salient? What are the most salient variables of identity to them? So in terms of geographically speaking and historically and archaeologically speaking, the term Mesoamerica was actually coined by a German-Mexican scholar. I believe he was living in Mexico at the time. He's a former, he was from Germany. Paul Kirchhoff was an anthropologist and archaeologist who was interested in studying the history and the ancient, prehistoric contexts of Mexico and Central America. And he basically developed a list, a trait list. And this is very telling of anthropology at the time. In the mid-20th century, under the cultural historical approach, if you've taken any anthropological theory, anthropologists had a tendency to sort of define cultural groups and regional sort of areas of those cultural groups according to traits. So Kirchhoff's traits, and this is just a partial list of them, include things like practicing agriculture in lake gardens, which the Aztecs called chinampas, in the domestication, consumption, and even use as a currency of cacao, or the plant that produces chocolate, of the use of bark paper, making tools and weapons with obsidian, a volcanic glass, the production of stepped pyramids in terms of architectural practices, the ability to write, the development of some different writing traditions, solar calendars. We'll talk about this a little bit more in a subsequent lecture. Calendars and writing being related concepts for Mesoamerica. Ritual human sacrifice, long-distance trade, etc. And to be clear, I'm not questioning any of these. I'm not saying that these things are not Mesoamerican. Rather, Kirchhoff's list sort of implies this practice of the mid-20th century of defining a cultural group according to a list of traits. Now, in the 21st century, and this is one of the readings you have assigned early in this class, Rosemary Joyce and some other scholars have explored, well, how do we update this concept of Mesoamerica? Is it still useful to us? And Joyce in particular suggests that many of the things Kirchhoff listed are still true. We're not questioning those, but rather let's look at Mesoamerica as not just a set of traits, but rather a series of shared practices, communities of people who practiced certain kinds of subsistence production, certain types of long-distance exchange, exchanging particular types of goods, particular belief and ritual practices, particular types of social stratification. So in a sense, she's keeping Kirchhoff's list. She's just asking us to consider it in a different way as a group of shared practices rather than as just a laundry list of features. Now, as is discussed in the preface of your textbook, the Western social sciences and anthropology as part of the Western social sciences owe part of their origin to the quote-unquote discovery of the New World and of Mesoamerica by Europeans, and the process that Europeans had to go through to sort of redefine how they thought about humanity in light of these really different cultures that they discovered. Now, this is not to say that all of the agency for the development of the social sciences belongs to Europeans. As we will see, some of the Spanish religious leaders who originally wrote down features of Mesoamerican cultures really were doing it in collaboration with indigenous people, not just sort of on top of indigenous people. So Europeans and their indigenous collaborators had to come up with new ways to describe, to conceptualize cultural difference, and then these new cultures discovered in Mesoamerica were also sort of brought into colonial era legal schemes and, for example, Spanish court practices and so forth. And as native groups and the Spanish colonial legal system sort of clashed and met and interacted and exchanged information, there was a lot of emphasis, much of it on the part of the church, to try to understand how to deal with cultural difference. Now, it's true that in many ways, or in many cases, church officials were learning how to interact with native cultures with the ultimate goal of converting them to Catholicism. So it should also be kept in mind that in many cases they had sort of an ulterior motive. Now, that said, I want to be careful in this class not to paint with such a broad brush that I'm implying all church officials in the 16th century for the Spanish Catholic Church, for example, were the same. I'm not going to imply that. As we will see, some of these officials had really different approaches to native culture. So, for example, one famous church official of the early colonial era was the Franciscan friar Bernardino de Sahagún. Now, some have called him kind of the first anthropologist or the first ethnographer. He learned to speak Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs. He spent 50-some years studying the Aztecs. He is credited with having written the Florentine Codex, which is a long and detailed book that gives us much of our information about Aztec society. But in fact, the Florentine Codex was a product of collaboration between Sahagún and his native informants. But for his time, if we're thinking about this as him as an example of 16th century thought, he was relatively scientific and relatively interested in the welfare of the native peoples that he was working with. Another character in the Catholic Church early on in the colonial era who at least came to care about human rights and care about how the native peoples were treated by the Spanish system was Bartolomé de las Casas, a Dominican friar. Now, he saw firsthand in the Caribbean how terribly some of the Spanish conquistadors, including Cortez, who would later be one of the leaders of the assault on Tenochtitlan, the city of the Aztecs, he saw how terribly they were treating the Carib natives of the Caribbean. And he eventually, as he rose up the ranks of the church, became the first bishop of Chiapas. And he ultimately engaged in some debates about basically human rights with other officials, for example, one named Sepulveda, about whether or not the natives were human, for example, and how they deserved to be treated. Now, de las Casas changed his mind over time. He originally said, well, the natives are getting sick, they're dying, they should be replaced with African slaves who would be stronger. He came over time, over the course of his own life, to say, hey, you know what? Slavery of anyone is wrong. So consider, for the 16th century, as sort of a person in a position of power in a colonial regime, de las Casas was growing a new concept of human rights and eventually became a champion defending the natives against maltreatment by the colonial system. Now, on the opposite end of that spectrum, at least in my mind, is a Spanish bishop of Yucatan, Diego de Landa. Now, Diego de Landa can be credited with writing down a lot of information about the Maya. Without de Landa, we might not know a lot about religion, writing, language, and other practices of the Maya. But he was also forcibly converting people to Catholicism, and in something that for me actually is really difficult to talk about because it's so reminiscent of something that the Nazis did. De Landa organized massive book burnings. It's very, very rare for us to find pre-Hispanic Mesoamerican books. They existed. They're often called codices. Sometimes they're found in, locked away in European museums after being there for centuries, or they might be found in some cases in having been curated in indigenous towns, but most of them were destroyed. There are really only a couple dozen pre-Hispanic texts that have been preserved, and part of that is because Diego de Landa burned as many as he could find. So this is culture side. This is de Landa's deliberate attempt to wipe out indigenous culture in Mesoamerica because he thought it was the work of the devil. So I want to just sort of briefly remind you as we close out this introductory lecture, what are the main goals of the class? Our focus here is on indigenous Mesoamericans, both who were they in the past with an archaeological and historical perspective, but also who are they today, because this is ultimately a cultural anthropology course. I want us to consider the history of Mesoamerica both on its own terms and in terms of global networks of interaction. I want us to consider indigenous Mesoamericans in terms of transnationalism, diaspora communities. We'll see some interesting content about that. And then I want to sort of give us a chance to question and explore a little bit what are some of the origins, developments, and complexities of this great non-Western cultural tradition that I'm going to call Mesoamerica. And I also want us to consider, and there's no right answer to this. I just want you to think about it. What would our lives be like without Mesoamerican culture? Even just walking into the grocery store, imagine no corn, no chocolate, no tomatoes, no avocados, possibly no pumpkins, domesticated bees, domesticated turkeys, domesticated deer, all these amazing foods that Mesoamerica, just the food, all these foods that Mesoamerica left us. What would our lives be like without them? I want us to consider those types of things and also to think more broadly about Mesoamerican cultural practices. And so I'm going to leave you with this fun image that I took during a religious festival in coastal Oaxaca several years ago. There's a lot going on in this image. What you see here is a group of dancers performing a calendrical dance ritual as part of a Catholic festival. But there's also a lot going on. There's cross-dressing, young men dressed as young women. There are masks that represent, or at least historically represented, the burned faces of the Spanish conquistadors turning pink in the sun. The mask in the foreground likely refers to Afro descendants, Afro-Mexican descendants of African slaves who were brought to Mexico. So this is a complex place. This is a complex syncretic practice. Here we see native and Catholic beliefs blending together, as well as sort of artifacts of the history of the region where I work in Oaxaca. So I'm looking forward to this class with you. I will be posting another lecture to this weekly module shortly, and please email me if you have any questions.